I love smallmouth. See, I talked and I gave a smallmouth seminar here last year about my power finesse approach, how I use, you know, there's a magic button for smallmouth. Anytime you find them smallmouth following your baits back to the boat, there's a way to catch them. There's always a way. It's not always easy to find. I don't always find it. But I've developed a couple, you know, some power baits, a series of power baits, and a series of finesse baits that I use, that I go through this whole cycle. And I never know what it's going to be. I don't know. I can catch them on a jerkbait one day, heck, 1 hour, and the next hour they won't touch a jerkbait. And a lot of people think smallmouth move because of that, because they're like, oh, they were eating a jerkbait, that school of fish must have moved. But I'm of the theory that they don't move as much as we think they do. They stay in an area to feed because there's a lot of bait there, but they change their mood, man. They go from, I mean, snapping to whoop, can't make them bite. But I continually try to trigger strikes going through that power finesse approach, and I know a lot of you guys saw that, and I'll show you some of the baits I use later. But what I wanted to talk about today was the seasonal patterns. And I think that's probably the most important thing in fishing, is understanding the seasonal patterns. It's one of the things that Bass Gold does. It really dials into what the seasonal patterns are of fish by telling, you know, what types of cover that these fish are going to be caught on at different times of year. You can be the best, I don't know, deep water fisherman in the world, deep crankbait guy, but if they're all on the bank, you're not going to get a bite, right? So you got to know where the fish are. And the first thing that, you know, that we look for is the spawn that's going to be coming on here. As soon as the ice out comes, right, the fish are going to be biting on those the edges. Deeper, steeper rocks is where we're going to find those fish once this ice out comes, and I'm kind of zipping along here. The spawn is going to come up next. And man, I love sight fishing for smallmouth when they spawn. They're hard to find because a lot of times smallmouth spawn out in the middle of the lake. They spawn in places that are deeper than you're used to looking for largemouth in. They're places that are unprotected from the wind. And just a little bit of rifflage on the water, you go blind. I mean, the bottom goes dark on you and you can't see down that deep. So, but there's a couple things that I use to find them. Jerkbaits and swim baits. Jerkbaits and swim baits, sometimes they'll catch them off the beds, but mainly it lets you see them, right? And so you want to be watching your bait all the way back to the boat on our deep, clear lakes that we have up here. And you jerkbait, and what'll happen a lot of times, them smallmouth down at the bottom, they'll flash the side. They'll give you that intimidation. They want to try to intimidate that jerkbait. They'll give them their side, and you can see that. Because I'm telling you, smallmouth, they're even better at largemouth at camouflage. I mean, you can be on a sand flat, and there'll be a 4-pound smallmouth out there, and you can't see them, you know. And so on a spawning bed, a lot of times, I'm going to show you a good picture of one. It's so hard to see them. Sometimes they glow, but that's only when you're lucky. Most of the times, it's just rock, and just different hues of rock is what you see. And but jerkbaits and swim baits will get them to commit. It'll get them to do something, where you can maybe see them a little bit. And here's another cool thing about smallies is they bed in colonies. You know, they're kind of like bluegills, not so much, but if you got a good smallmouth population in your lake, if you find one bedder, they're gonna be there in numbers, you know, and they'll get right next to each other. You can get a good chunk rock, and there'll be 2 or 3 beds all around it, you know. And so they like to, you know, they like to spawn together. So you find one, all right, slow down. Now we could possibly be around some more. But this is a cool deal. It's called a flogger. And I've just started experimenting with it. But the cool thing about this is it takes that rifflage factor off, the sheen, the glare. It gives you like 10 more feet of visibility in our lakes. 10 feet. Now it's hard to use. It's hard to use your trolling motor. Sometimes you got to drift and use it. But you can drift over shoals, spawn or even post-spawn, and you can see fish so much deeper than you could see under a variety of conditions. You know, so you're no longer worried about just a little bit of wind, you know, and it can really help you. It's a little bit cumbersome to use, but during the spawn, yeah, it's something that you should experiment with. You look ridiculous when you're using it, but it definitely helps you get additional penetration down into some deeper depths. I had a tournament up on Lake Champlain that they were spawning, and I had some spawners located shallow, and they were easy, and I kept looking, and I went along and we had this period of time for 45 minutes where it went slick as glass. It never happens. It never happens. And as soon as it went slick, I looked down and I realized I had been sitting around a whole school of smallmouth the whole time. But I could not see them, even with like a 4 or 5 mile an hour wind. You just couldn't see them. But when it went slick, man, you could see them everywhere. And so, you know, the conditions are key. I use land masses to try to block the wind. I use any land feature I can to try to get into a position where I can see them. But they're just so much fun to catch when they're on the beds. It's worth the effort. Rocky areas is where they're going to spawn. They like gravel. The thing that I learned about smallmouth is the big boulders aren't the best kind of habitat. The flat pea gravel is not the best kind of habitat. You want to get them boulders about yay big. You find an area that's got the right depth, the right location, and it's got these basketball-sized boulders. They love those things. I have a theory on it. I don't know why. This is my theory. I don't know if it's true is what I'm trying to say. But the big boulders, I think, bring too much shade and they blocks the sun. The little boulders, there's a lot more sun penetration that can get around it, but it still gives them a defensible position, gives them a back against the wall. So, but I've seen this over and over again. Bedding smallmouth, you're gonna get around chunk rock around this big, and that's going to be the magic deal. But medium-sized boulders, they offer protection. The offshore structure, that's one of the neat and problematic things about smallmouth. They'll bed out in the middle of the lake on a shoal. They'll bed on islands out in the middle. They'll bed on long points that jut way out, and they'll also bed back in pockets and protected areas. So they're likely to be anywhere. But and that's the kind of the cool part about it. Makes them a little bit tricky to find sometimes. But like I said, once you find one, I mean, you know, you're often going to find many. This is a typical smallmouth spawning bed. And you know, it doesn't come too good here in this. It looks better on my PC. But what it shows the boulders that I'm talking about. These big rocks, they'll be right next to them. This is the bed right here. And it usually, I mean, it's so often it looks like this to me. Sometimes it'll be real obvious. You'll see sand spots and they'll look real glowy. And everybody's going to find them. This is the kind of stuff that makes them so hard to find is, man, you can hardly distinguish that there's a bed there. But he puts his bed right next to a boulder or a couple, something that's defensible, and it looks like this. It looks like gravelly in the middle of the bed. And that's the kind of thing that I look for when I'm out there looking for spawning beds. What do you catch them on? Anything you want. They're aggressive, man. They love it. Soft plastics of just about any variety will do, catching a fish off the spawning bed. The key is being able to get that bait into the spawning bed. You ever try to get a bait into a spawning bed in 15 or 17 feet of water? It's tricky, man. The bed's this big, you know, you pitch it out there and you're like, oh, that'll do it, and it'll fall and it'll go off to the other side. But there's a couple ones I really like. I like to use, once again, a Senko. It's just, it's a steady bait. It falls on a jig head and it doesn't glide too dramatically, so it'll get me near there. And I'll use up to a 3/8 ounce side. Weight it almost doesn't matter. A heavier weight's better because it doesn't drift as much, and it's going to help you get down and stay down. I usually use a ball-headed jig. That happens to be football-headed jigs shown up there, but I usually use a ball-headed jig. I'm just trying to get it into the bed. And the chartreuse tail is what I use a lot because I can see it. That's the important part about it. You want to be able to see whether you hit the bed or not. And with that chartreuse tail, I can usually see whether I'm in the bed or not. Sometimes, a lot of times, you don't even have to be that close. You can throw it out, a bait will be halfway down to the bed, and he'll just come up and meet it and get it. So they can be that aggressive. Another great way to catch them is with a drop shot. And with a drop shot, you can even go heavier. You can go 1/2 ounce, 3/4 ounce weight, and you can flip out and you can drop that bait real effectively because a drop shot's going to fall straight. And you can drop that bait, drop shot right in his bed, and you know, it's usually 1, 2, or 3 casts, and you're going to trigger the strike from that fish.